would you please join me in welcoming Jay Bernstein, BZD member, today's moderator, and symposium co-chair.
Thank you, Karen. So, that being said, let's get underway. The first question, and we'll start with Minister Ben-Haim for her answer. The first question is as follows. This idea that support for Israel within America, or at least within the political class, is no longer a bipartisan issue. We see that over and over again. Is that accurate? And whether it's accurate or not, is there anything that the Israelis can do, that the Bennett administration, the Bennett government could do to broaden support within both parties?
You have to look, it's within our own Jewish community, the younger generation, but also, in general in the U.S. public, and even among evangelicals. Somebody said before, there's such stout supporters of Israel. The younger generation is shifting and not necessarily, following, I don't want to say blindly, so just following in their parents' footsteps or whatever they heard in church. But still, when you do look, when Gallup does their yearly polls about, do you favor this country or that, Israel is definitely getting, 75% and over still. It's still, like you said, when it comes down to it and you look, it's not an issue, but it is an issue. And this is what we deal with a lot. We're trying to deal with how do you approach and how do you talk to younger generations. But I think it's not just, taking the criticism and doing something, because I do think many times, also because of social media, but also because there are, I don't want to say anti-roots in there. They'll find something else to criticize, and they'll find other things to criticize. And that's not saying that Israel, there are some issues and some policies we need to change, we need to look into, period. But the whole conversation with the younger generations and the whole conversation about how do you approach that Israel needs to be a bipartisan issue, the necessity of having Israel exist in this world, the necessity of having a Jewish state, that's a different conversation. And you're right, we need to think how we deal with it. And it is difficult because it's complicated for us, and it's complicated for us to explain whereas for many younger people, they have a few key sentences or very, very, as you do when you're 21, 22, or 28, a very staunch worldview, and it's very hard to penetrate that and allow for a conversation. So you're right. On the one hand, I'm saying when you do the polls, most Americans, and it's definitely bipartisan, definitely as we saw in the vote, but we cannot ignore this issue of how we approach, how we talk, how we open channels of communication with the next leaders, with staffers today, Congress people tomorrow, law school today, lawyers tomorrow. We have to figure out how we do it.
I want to take a slight issue, Jonathan, if you'll forgive me with something that Jonathan said. I ask him to forgive me because I usually agree with everything he says. But I don't believe that this is necessarily cyclical. And that's my concern. When you look at the polling on Israel, I'm sure all of you have, it's really quite striking because Republican support for Israel is off the charts. I don't have it at my fingertips, but I think it's well over 80%. 85%.
The last Gallup.
If you look at polling, Pew does this polling about American attitudes toward everything. So they say, should you be faithful to your spouse? Is it okay to murder people and so on? Yeah. You get there are like one or two things, like you shouldn't murder people. You get 95% of Americans think murder is bad. I think 80s. I'm making the numbers up, but they're in this range. 88% think you should be faithful to your spouse, right? After that, boom, you're down in the 50s and 60s. There's nothing else that people agree except Israel. Israel's up there like that for the Republicans. For independents, it's very high. You'll know the number. What is it?
Last one was 77.
77 for it. Where is it for Democrats?
64.
64. Where is it for progressive Democrats? Yeah, 22 or something. I'm making it up. But once you go to progressives, boy, you've lost them, and that is the most dynamic element, the most dynamic, well-organized element in the party. And Israel is an issue that they care deeply about. For the independents and for the other Democrats, it's not so clear that they're focused on Israel. They are focused on Israel, and they are catechized on Israel. So you can sit down with somebody from somebody from Code Pink, and they'll tell you, chapter and verse about what they hate about Israel, what Israel's doing on the West Bank, and so on. You put a map in front of them and ask them to find the Gaza Strip, they can't do it. But they're they don't know where Tehran is on the map, right? But they have chapter and verse on Israel. So there's a kind of, for lack of a better word, a revolutionary movement in the Democratic Party, and it's quite focused on Israel. And it's not clear to me that the pendulum just swings before a hell of a lot of damage is done. We've seen windows shut in the world. We've seen edifices come crashing down. And so I can see them doing a lot of damage. And to me, what is striking, I take a different conclusion from it from Jonathan, is a guy like Chuck Schumer. Schumer goes around, or used to go, maybe he still does, you guys would know better than me, calling himself Shomer Israel, right? Where is Shomer Israel on the JCPOA today? It's like this. He's completely hiding his head. He won't even touch the issue. You see him on the stand next to AOC. He won't criticize AOC in public. It's not just 8 members of the 8 young members of the House. They have the moral high ground in the Democratic Party right now, or they have all the momentum in the Democratic Party, and nobody wants to go against them. That's why Nancy Pelosi wants to be photographed on the cover of Rolling Stone with these characters. So I think I draw only one conclusion from this, and it's the one I said before. They have to be defeated. They have to be defeated. We can't cleverly argue them out of the way. We can't demand some changes from Israel and they're gonna forget about the issue. They have it in their crosshairs because they're carrying out a revolution. And the revolution is here at home.
Thank you.
I got addicted to it last time.
Is the two-state solution dead? And if yes, what replaces it?
Very simple and to the point.
I'll let you start with this.
I was going to just tell you to do it.
If anyone wants to take it.
I think it's on life support. I think it's been on life support for a long time, and I think that's a very generous reading of its current viability and its future trajectory. And I think the status quo that replaces it is the status quo that essentially already exists right now, which is a one-state reality.
So I think it's dead, basically, in the sense that I come at this from an American national security point of view, and I think that what is now euphemistically called the Arab Spring. We saw what happened to Syria. We saw what's going on in Iraq and elsewhere. And we see that the United States is pulling back from the region. The United States needs a regional order that is guaranteed by close allies. It needs stability in the region that's guaranteed by close allies. There's no guarantee to us, to the United States, that if we demanded that Israel pull back from the West in the West Bank, we wouldn't see a repeat of what we've seen in Gaza or what we've seen in Lebanon. We were sold, and I helped do the selling in my little part, but we were sold the idea that if Israel pulled back in 2000 from Lebanon, actually I didn't sell that one, I sold the Gaza one, not the 2000, that Hezbollah would stop, would be mollified. It wasn't mollified. So every time Israel pulls back, rockets and missiles follow, and those are rockets and missiles that are provided by Iran. That has to be the dominant thinking of the United States. So whatever, we can have a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians, but Israel has to have security control over the Jordan Valley. It doesn't necessarily have to mean sovereignty. I don't think that matters from an American point of view, but it has to have security control over the Jordan Valley. Given current thinking among Palestinians, I cannot imagine the Palestinian side accepting a state under those conditions. I certainly can't imagine Abu Mazen, who I'm sure is going to live to 120, but I can't imagine him accepting it. So I think it's as good as dead. It doesn't mean the United States should be actively trying to destroy it or even needs to address it. And I just make one other quick point, which is, from an American national security point of view, given all that we've talked about, rise of China, rise of Iran, disintegration of key elements in the Middle Eastern order, and so forth, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as important as it is to Israelis and Palestinians, and as important as it is to the progressive left of the United States, is not an American national security priority. It's a second-tier issue. It is not the driving issue in the Middle East. It's not the driving issue for any major actor in the Middle East. It's not the driving issue for the United States, and it shouldn't be the driving issue for the United States. And those who are making it the driving issue, when John Kerry said no, has to be Israeli-Palestinian peace first, they're using it. The smartest among them, the Barack Obamas, the Rob Malleys, the smartest among them are using the Israeli-Palestinian issue as a club to beat up the Israelis in order to cow them on the Iran question. They know they're doing it. It's not because they care so much about the Palestinians. It's because they want to make sure the Israelis don't get in the way of what they do care about.
I'll say a couple things. One is, nothing in the Middle East is ever dead, even when it's buried. It's just remarkable, how people hold on to paradigms, leaders that you thought were completely out of the running somehow find a way back, and are able to win again. And so I don't think the two-state solution paradigm is dead. I do think it is on life support. I would say, though, that it's interesting. I had a guy that came through town maybe 2 months ago from Israel, representing Shalom Achshav, Peace Now, which always kind of cracked me up because they've been calling themselves that for a very long time and now keep shifting the goalposts, keep moving. But, he was incredibly frustrated that we weren't moving forward on the two-state solution, and how could we not understand that this is something that has to happen now? And I said, look, I think you're missing the point here. A year ago, we had 3 leaders that were not going to ever even think about returning to the two-state solution. Donald Trump, I know he had his peace through prosperity, the deal of the century, it was huge, all that kind of stuff. But, he wasn't interested in getting down into the weeds and actually making peace. And Bibi, absolutely not interested either. Okay, now you have Biden in, and you've got Bennett in, and both of them are pragmatists. They're, I think, at least willing to discuss this, even if neither one of them probably see, a driving reason to pursue the two-state solution. They would be open to it. I have to say that the biggest impediment right now is the guy that's going to live to 120. Probably the most corrupt leader in the Middle East at this point. Political corruption, financial corruption. It's amazing. The guy, everybody's been predicting his demise for years. For a while he was a pack-a-day smoker. Now he only vapes. He's getting healthier as he gets older. But he's not going anywhere, and he won't name a successor. And so I actually see Abu Mazen right now as probably the greatest impediment to the revival of a paradigm, which I'm not sure should be revived. But I certainly see him as such. But let me just say, and I think this maybe echoes a little bit of what Mike said, and I do forgive you for disagreeing with me. It's okay. But I'll just say that, if you really want peace, you got to topple the regime in Iran. I'm sorry, but if you look at the death of the peace process in 2000, 2001, and the rise of the Second Intifada, it came about because Hamas had been receiving hundreds of millions of dollars in training and weapons from Iran since 1989. Okay? If you look at what's going on today, you have Hamas and Hezbollah with tens of thousands of rockets facing Israel and threatening Israel every day. They are the greatest impediment to peace, and they are funded, they are sponsored, they are promoted by Iran. You want to actually clear the path for a two-state solution, get rid of the enemies of peace, And that's not Israel. It's the proxies that target Israel on a regular basis. And it's remarkable to me that this is not clear to this administration or any other, that Iran is the greatest impediment to peace in the Middle East.
Well, we're right on schedule, so we'll now get to the questions from the audience, and I'll try to get through as many of them as I can, and we'll try to maybe keep the answers a little bit shorter so we can maybe get through them. The first question is about the Evangelical Movement, particularly Christians United for Israel. These very pro-Israel organizations have many, many members. How influential or important are they to Israel's standing in the U.S. Congress?
They're really important when a Republican's in power and when you have a Republican Congress. Right now, I'm not sure. But I do see them as having an incredibly important role to play. And the important thing to remember, I still hear some folks on the left saying, well, all they want to do is just gather every Jew, put them in Israel, and then have the Messiah come. And that's called replacement theology. That is something that Pastor Hagee and Kufi reject 100%. They are true believers in the destiny of the Jewish people to run their own affairs and to have a Jewish state. They believe it is a covenant that was made between God and man, and I think they're a terrific organization.
Should also be mentioned about them that they were the first organization to publicly and privately pressure Rand Paul when he was obstructing to the Senate, fast-tracking the Iron Dome aid. So it's not as if they have a blind spot to Republican issues when it comes to fast-tracking military aid. So that's very important to note on Kufi's behalf as well.
Yeah, I think they're incredibly important. I think they are they more than more than the Zionist Jewish Zionist community are the bedrock of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. America is a pro-Israel country, with that exception of the progressive left. There's a very interesting document that every Zionist should be aware of, if you're not already, called the Blackstone Memorial. How many do not know what the Blackstone Memorial is? So, Blackstone Memorial was a petition to the president in 1890. Think about this date, 1890, by this guy Blackstone, who grew up poor, made a lot of money in real estate. I think he was from Chicago. Then he found Jesus, wrote a book called Jesus is Coming, one of the best-selling books in the United States, one of the best-selling books ever, but in the United States in the 19th century. And then he got concerned about the plight of the Jews in Eastern Europe. I know Ray said keep the answer short, so I'll keep this to 20 minutes. Anyway, he put together this, he got concerned about the plight of the Jews. He saw the Ottoman Empire is crumbling. Old nations like Greece are coming back. He believed that Israel was going to return, and he believed that the job of the United States is to return the Jews to the Holy Land. And he had this petition, organized this petition, and presented it to the president. And the interesting thing about the petition is who signed it. It's amazing. J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, innumerable governors around the country, other very prominent people in public life. That's the thing to remember here. When was Herzl's Jewish State written? I think if I'm not mistaken, 96. 1896. So 6 years. America was Zionist 6 years before Herzl wrote a Jewish state. I think it's important to remember.
How active is the Syrian conflict on Israel's border right now, and is it a threat to Israel?
John, take this one.
So I mentioned in my list of acronyms earlier, I call it WBW. In Israel, they call it Mabam, Milchama Ben Milchamot. It is very active. The Israelis are bombing weaponry on a regular basis. Thousands and thousands of weapons have been destroyed with Israeli airstrikes. Look, it's not a threat from Syria per se, although there are Iranian-backed proxies that are looking to arm themselves to prepare for conflict with Israel. The big issue actually right now for the Israelis and why they're bombing Syria on a regular basis is because Iran is trying to transfer weaponry to Hezbollah in Lebanon. These weapons are, I'll give you another acronym. We love acronyms in Washington. They're called PGMs, Precision Guided Munitions. PGMs basically will allow Iran, most of the rockets that you see being fired out of Gaza or even in the last Lebanon war, you'll see that a lot of them, Iron Dome doesn't even need a target. Good. Why? Because they're fired in the air, they're actually fired blindly. We call them dumb rockets. They have no idea when they fire them where exactly they're going to land, which, by the way, makes every one of those rockets a war crime, just saying. And nobody talks about that. But the thing is that what Iran has come to realize is that unless they can make these rockets more accurate, they're never going to win a war against Israel. So what they're now doing is shipping in different software, circuitry, fins, eyes to put on the cones. They need to adjust these weapons in order to be more effective against Israel. And when I say more effective, what they want to do is they want to hit the chemical plant in Haifa, they want to hit the nuclear reactor in Dimona, they want to hit the Kiryat, the head of the Ministry of Defense in Tel Aviv. They want to hit strategic targets and they can't do it. And with this material, they can make these dumb rockets which just go up and then come down. You can allow them to go side to side, up and down, evade Iron Dome, make them more accurate and make them navigatable, which is incredibly important. And so Israel is aware of this. They have incredibly accurate intelligence on what is coming through the Damascus airport, what is being driven by truck across Syria into Lebanon, and Israel is bombing it with regularity. And this is the key. Every time now when you open up Ynet or Haaretz primarily, Jerusalem Post or whatever you're reading, and you'll see explosions taking place in Syria, know that that's what's going on. It's a cat and mouse game against PGMs, precision guided munitions. And this is the key to understanding that theater. Yes, there are other Iranian assets that are being bombed there. Yes, we've seen actually Iranian leaders, military figures also being killed on the ground over there. But the primary asset that Israel is looking to neutralize are PGMs. And just by the way, Aviv Kochavi, the head of the Israeli military, made a speech, I guess it was last year, where he said that number one threat to Israel, military threat, is the Iranian nuclear program. Number two, PGMs.
Can I ask you a question, actually? So what do you make of Russia trying to control Syrian airspace? I mean, do you think that's going to be more of an issue moving forward, or do you think that is currently an issue?
Am I allowed to take a question from the panel?
It's their
Yes, you are.
With China,
Okay. He's a journalist, so I feel like I'm doing my job.
Old habits die hard.
Look, it's really interesting. I've actually talked to a number of the Israelis that have gone and met with Putin in Russia, people that have been in the room. And it's really interesting. The Israelis say, we never ask for permission to bomb. We tell them what we are going to do. It's our neighborhood, it's our right, and they know it. And Putin pretends like he's upset about it, but he knows that there's no stopping the Israelis. And the worst thing would happen is if the Russians got in the way of one of these, then it would be an international mess, and Putin would come under fire at home, and it's the last thing that he wants. So he actually stands down and allows for it. But don't forget, though, that Putin is still looking at Israel much in the same way that Mike described the way that China is looking at Israel. He'd like to bring China into the Russian tent. And so the conversations that I've heard are actually somewhat funny, where Putin says, yeah, okay, fine. You can go ahead and bomb those PGMs. I'm aware, we'll stand down in this sector over the next 2 weeks. You do whatever you need to do. But, by the way, I noticed that you're flying those crappy F-16s that the Americans make. Wouldn't you rather fly one of our Sukhois? We'll give you one for free. We'll let you try it out. You can let us know. And it's very funny. It's all part of Putin's attempts to gain a bit more leverage in that part of the world, and he has not let go, even as they have some discrepancies with the Israelis.
Yeah, but if the question also, I think if they referred specifically to, sorry about this, to the Syrian civil war of what's happening there for years and years when we thought it would, be over, that's not affecting Israel as what's happening. I think the long-term effects of this war, all the refugees, the millions in Jordan and going down to Turkey and others that we'll have to see, that will have an effect on the whole region. But the war in itself, what's happening within Syria and Assad is not affecting Israel. But exactly, it's being used by Iran to try and settle itself on the borders of Israel, and that's the issue. That's an issue with us.
To me, the crucial thing to watch is the Biden administration's attempt to normalize the Assad regime, because that's going to make it more and more difficult for the Israelis to act with impunity. And the other thing to watch is that the Russians and the Iranians are in an alliance. It's not a perfect alliance, and there are tensions there. So one of the arguments that you're hearing now, and you hear it from Israelis as well as from Americans, from the Israelis, it's too clever by half. From the Americans, it's dishonest. The argument is that we can separate the Russians and the Iranians, because really what the Russians are all about is contracts in the end. And there's actually a competition for contracts between the Russians and the Iranians. And long term, there's going to be a big conflict between them. These are I was responsible for the Middle East in the White House in 2005 to 7. Back then, the version of that argument was that there's a conflict going on between Tehran and Damascus over Hezbollah, and that's what's going to separate the Iranians and the Syrians. There's always this, those who want to engage Russia, Iran, Syria, they always express that desire for engagement in terms of some clever realpolitik, which is going to split all of our enemies and make us much stronger, or flip one of the enemies. The Syrians are actually going to flip over to our side at one point, and so forth. Their desire for engagement always precedes the little clever realpolitik argument. But the Israelis are buying into it a bit. The Israelis have this coalition now in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Israelis being worried somewhat about Turkey and being excited because the UAE is learning Hebrew, and it's the UAE's favorite country is Israel. So the UAE and Egypt and Greece and Cyprus and together with the French and maybe even the Indians are representing this new bloc in international politics, and what they're missing in all of this is that the French are pro-Iran. The French are working with the Russians the French are behind the effort to normalize the Hezbollah order in Lebanon and to reach out to Damascus, because they want contracts. The French want contracts in Lebanon. They have other goals as well, but they want the contracts. The French are the reason that Hezbollah is not designated a terrorist organization in Europe. The UAE is also pro-engagement of Assad. And the UAE makes the argument that Assad's natural place is with his Arab brothers and not with these Persians and so on. And the Israelis either to play nice with their new partners, or because they actually get snowed by this rhetoric or start to move in that direction sometime. It's all nonsense. Russia, Iran, and Syria are tied together almost inseparably. There are tensions between them for sure, but we're not going to divide them.
We have a question or several questions from our online audience, so let's go to that.
Didn't Israel do business with her Arab neighbors before the name Abraham Accords were even made a big deal?
Yeah. The Abraham Accords is a great achievement, of the Trump administration, of our previous government. Obviously, it's a huge deal, and it has a huge impact, and it's changing many things. And I do think less than hopefully 3 to 7 years, other countries will join. We can discuss it later because I have some questions for you on that. But yeah, for years and years, Israel has had different ties and different talks and different negotiations, more covert, less covert, but it's not, these things don't happen, don't happen in a year and don't happen in 4 years, and it's many years in the making with ups and downs. And we've had relationships, open relationships with other Gulf countries in the past. We've also lost them, but again, these are things that it's built layer by layer and slowly and in different contexts for many years.
I'll give a quick anecdote. In 2004, I went to Iraq. I was working for another think tank, and we traveled from the north of the country, Kurdistan, all the way to the south, in the Shiite south. And everywhere we went, this is while the war was going on, everywhere we went, things were blowing up, gunfights, IEDs. It was a pretty harrowing experience. And by the time we got to Basra, the group that I was with was exhausted and their nerves were frayed, as were mine. And they said, okay, John, you speak some Arabic. We want you to go downstairs to the front desk to get us something to drink. And so I said, you're nuts. We're in a Shiite bastion in Iraq in the middle of a war. You're out of your mind. And they said, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? I was thinking, okay, I got plenty of ideas about that. But at any rate, I went downstairs, and my most polite Arabic asked the guy at the front desk if there was a possibility that we could buy alcohol. So he says, give me $20 and go upstairs to your room and wait. So we went upstairs, 20 minutes goes by, nothing, 40 minutes goes by, we're bored, we start watching I think it was the Czech Republic versus Greece playing soccer to give you how bored we were. And so about an hour goes by, and then finally there's a knock on the door, and I open it up, and the guy's sweating, and he's pale, and he's looking up and down the hallway, making sure nobody sees him. And he says, what I'm about to give you stays here in your room. Don't tell anybody, leave everything here, we'll clean it up tomorrow. I want another $20, bakshish, I want a tip. I give him that, and I'm thinking, okay, this better be good. We open up the bag, and it's Gold Star beer from Israel. So if you're wondering about whether Israel has been doing business with other countries in the Arab world, it's been going on for a while.
The question is, if Hamas wins the next election for government in the West Bank, well, the question is, will there ever be another election in the West Bank? But I guess to rephrase it, is there a possibility that Hamas would take power in the West Bank, and what will be the consequences of that for the United States and Israel?
I think everybody learned their lesson last time around. I don't think anyone is going to allow Hamas to win an election, whether it means preventing them from running or making sure that the election ends the way it should. I can't see anyone involved, whether it's the Israelis, the Palestinian Authority, or the United States allowing it.
So I have a slightly different take on that, which is I would blame the most recent round of conflict on the Biden administration's failure to recognize exactly that. The Biden administration, the Palestinians declared that they were going to hold an election in April. They declared it the year before. Nobody thought anything about it. Then Trump loses. Biden wins. And I was on a call with a senior government official. I won't name names because it was supposed to be off the record, but it was a Biden administration official who said, we can't tell anybody how to hold an election. If you look at what happened to us on January 6th, we've got flaws in our own system, and far be it from us to tell other people whether they should hold a vote or not. And what they basically did is they gave a green light to Hamas and the PA moving forward on elections. And then finally, the Israelis began to weigh in, And the Egyptians weighed in, the Jordanians weighed in, the Emiratis weighed in, and all of a sudden pressure was building that they shouldn't allow Hamas, a terrorist organization that's opposed to peace, and it would absolutely, if they won one seat, would prompt a cutoff of aid from the U.S. Congress, that it would be a disaster of America, with American fingerprints on it. But the moment that Abbas announced that he canceled those elections was the moment that Hamas was bruising for a fight. Because they realized that they couldn't win the hearts and minds of the Palestinian people by way of the vote. So what do? They start looking for an excuse to win the hearts and minds by other means. And for Hamas, those other means are rockets. It's war. And if you actually look at the outcome, I mean, I talked to Israeli officials about this when I was there in June. They said Hamas got everything that it wanted, right? It was able to reassert itself politically. It was able to cast itself as the defender of Jerusalem. And it was able to sort of shrug off the election debacle. And people are still talking now about how to sideline Hamas rather than Hamas was sidelined. And so, you see this thing, it continues to creep in. Every once in a while, that somehow people in the White House think, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? I think we've seen it a couple times already. I hope we don't see version 3 of this movie in another couple of years.
Do we have an online question?
I think we got a similar question from the floor, but I'll ask it here for the benefit of the people at home. For Jonathan, does Israel pivot to China, who's already running the Haifa port?
No. I mean, look, they're running the Haifa port, and it's a very discreet agreement with boundaries. And the Israelis did a lot, and Tammy, you may have some additional things to say about this. They did a lot to contain that agreement, along with other agreements that they have with China. But look, what's happened over the last couple of years, it began with Trump, and I will say it was probably, if you want to think about Trump's contribution to the U.S.-Israel relationship, the greatest contribution may not have been the Abraham Accords. It may have been the discussions that began in 2017, 2018 about the Israel-China relationship and how to contain that so that Israel doesn't get caught up in the buzzsaw of great power competition. And so what we're seeing right now is a structure that's put in place where the Israelis are able to review investments made by China or proposed by China, where they are able to deconflict with the United States up front rather than watching a crisis unfold 6 months, 8 months, 2 years later, as we saw with the Haifa port. The Haifa port, I mean, it was an amazing thing. There were Israeli officials that weren't even aware that it was going to happen before it was announced. The mayor of Haifa was not aware of what was going on, and there was no way for her to engage with the Israeli government on this. There lacked a structure. There now is one, and I think the Israelis now, and I actually heard this from a senior official who was in town just this week, who said, look, we didn't get it before. It took a couple of years, but we get it now. We know who our friends are, and we know what we need to do in order to make sure that they stay our friends.
We received the same question from several people, the gist of which is, how can we, the supporters of Israel, the pro-Israel community in the United States, influence the perception of Israel? Whether it's greater or lesser, we know there are elements out there, politically and otherwise, who are hostile to Israel. What can we do to influence that or to change the conversation?
I'll take this one. I think actually engaging in conversation is a very good place to start. I think rather than just pushing it away, rather than falling back to this place of victimhood, rather than just assuming the worst bad faith in these criticisms, actually taking them at face value and actually reckoning with it and actually having a conversation. If it turns out that, these are bad faith attacks and then these are, ad hominem hate-based things, then you deal with it from there. But to just blanketly reject everything, I think, is a bad place to start, and I think that's where the pro-Israel community should start.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, and that's what we were saying, trying to find being willing, and you find sometimes less people like that, being willing to be part of the conversation. These conversations aren't always easy. They're sometimes very difficult and not pleasant to hear or be engaged in, but be willing to listen and hold these conversations and hopefully be able to represent or know or bring the other side that many people don't have the time or the patience or the willingness to listen to, that You said what they showed sometimes on Arab television, sometimes taking a step back and wait a minute, let's look at the wider picture, and let's look what happened, before or after, or what does that mean, and not just the little meme or the awful thing that's showing. And it's a very, the fact, as we said, you're here right Sunday morning, so it means you care. You're asking this question, so which means you want to do something. So that's already so many positive steps, but that's what we basically need, more and more people to be willing to talk in person, to talk online, to call out things if they're wrong, if they're anti-Semitic, if they're, if they need to be corrected. And I think that's a lot. Every person who does it, it is a lot. It is read, it is out there. So that's basically, I think, what we have to do.
I think it's useful to put the U.S.-Israeli relationship in the larger context of the major dynamics in the region and the U.S. relationships with other parts of the region. Just look at what happened in Afghanistan. We spent 20 years in a war there, and when I don't know how many trillions of dollars we spent in trillions, wasn't it? And I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but in Afghanistan, and we left, and the Taliban took over more of Afghanistan than it had before we sunk all of that blood and treasure into the country. And just in the withdrawal alone, the equipment we left behind is staggering. And so if you compare the number, the dollar values, the equipment, and the outcomes to what we got for that effort and what we get for $3.8 billion a year in Israel, it seems to me quite obvious that we get a much better deal, and an incredibly cheap deal with Israel, and we get a result that is tremendously reliable, and it goes way beyond just having Israel as an ally in the Eastern Mediterranean. Israel is the anchor of the Jordanian American, of the stability of Jordan, and the Jordanian American relationship. It's also an anchor in the Egyptian American relationship. So I think the whole Eastern Mediterranean is stabilized thanks to the relationship with Israel. Don't just compare it with Afghanistan, compare it with Iraq. In Iraq, we sunk, again, an enormous amount of blood and treasure. Again, we're talking trillions of dollars. I don't know the numbers exactly. And after we pull back, our adversaries move in. The Americans can't even do business in. You know what? Between 2010 and 2018, Chinese investment in Iraq expanded by 1,000%. And that's because the Iranians have made it impossible for the Americans to do business in Iraq. If you go, you risk being killed by an Iranian militia if you do business in Iraq. But China has a free hand, and so they have taken advantage. I don't think this is happening by accident. I think the Chinese and the Iranians are working together more or less on this. But we're getting a great deal from Israel, and I think we need to explain that. It's not that we're not doing Israel a favor by assisting it. We're doing ourselves a favor.
I think we have a couple more questions. I appreciate everyone taking the time to submit questions. A lot of them deal with issues that have already been addressed, but let's go with a few more. One is there a danger that Afghanistan, now under the control of the Taliban, will become another Iran or otherwise threaten Israel?
I don't think Afghanistan poses a serious threat to Israel. If there's a return to the global jihad, and to the extent that the global jihad threatens everyone, it's a threat to Israel. But I think the focus there is going to be the immediate problem there is going to be more localized. There's a Chinese-Pakistani alliance. And the Chinese are going to turn a blind eye. We're telling ourselves that the Chinese don't like the global jihad either because they have the Uyghur problem in Xinjiang. And so therefore they're going to sit on the Pakistanis who are going to sit on the Taliban. and prevent them from allowing Afghanistan to be a safe haven for the global jihad. But what's going to happen is that it's going to become a haven for, as it has always been, jihadis who want to attack India. That is to the advantage of the Chinese. That is to the advantage of the Pakistanis, and that's what the Taliban has always done. It's a way of keeping India off balance. There could be some blowback for Israel somewhere in there, but I would see it more as an opportunity for Israel to improve its relations with India.
I agree on the India point 100%. Look, the only thing that I'll just say on the global jihad issue is this, that for the last 20 years, America has, with some success, rolled back the global jihadi movement, right? Defeated ISIS. I don't know if we ever defeated Al-Qaeda, but in many places at least stamped it out, even if it enjoyed a resurgence elsewhere. But then there was also the kind of broader battle for hearts and minds, and this idea that if you are part of a jihadi movement, then you're kind of on the losing side of things. And really, if you think about it, over the last couple of years, jihadism has just not dominated our discussion, right? The discussion about global affairs has been focused on other things, whether it was Abraham Accords or China or whatever the case may be, pandemic for that matter. And you just didn't hear you didn't hear the problem of Islamism rearing its ugly head. And I get the sense right now that this Afghanistan withdrawal could put wind in the sails of the global jihadi movement. I mean, just think about actually what happened in 1989 when basically the precursor of the Taliban, the Mujahideen of Afghanistan, defeated the Soviet Union and forced them out of Afghanistan. What happened? You all of a sudden had this moment where people like Osama bin Laden believed that God was on his side and that it was time to build a global terrorist movement to defeat to defeat the West, and in particular the United States. And so, I think there is I would say a concern. We haven't seen it play out yet, but there is very much a possibility that global jihadism could see a resurgence, and that would be a headache for all of us.
I think we'll finish with a question that relates to something that's been spoken about over and over again this morning, which is the Iranian threat. It's clear the Biden administration wants to rejoin the JCPOA. Is a New Deal inevitable? And can Israel, in fact, live with a nuclear Iran?
I'll start. I know Mike and Tammy, I'm sure, have lots to say, and Ben, I know, has been doing a lot of coverage on this. Look, I think that, it's not inevitable. The Biden administration keeps throwing things, at the Iranians in the hopes that they return. There's no concession at this point that Rob Malley won't consider giving to the Iranians in order to entice them back into the deal, and yet it still hasn't happened. And I think that's good news. Not great news that Rob Malley's doing it, but it's great news that the Iranians haven't actually taken the bait, and that we have not found ourselves back in the middle of what was probably the most controversial and flawed diplomatic endeavor in modern American foreign policy. I don't know if, Mike, if you'd agree with that, but I can't think of anything that's more controversial.
Donald Trump said it, so it must be true.
Okay, that's true. There you go. But then there's the question of if in fact there is a deal. And I think, look, from everybody that I've talked to across the spectrum in Israel, hawks, doves, left, right, it's consistent. Israel cannot live with an Iranian nuclear weapon, and that's where I think the fireworks start. If you see a breakout, if you see a dash, a sneak out, whatever the term is for however Iran acquires that weapon. And by the way, that would also include even the status of something like Japan, that turnkey, where they have everything that they need, and all they need to do is assemble it. Even that will elicit a harsh response from Israel, and I fear that that will be the next great war. The hope, anyway, is that sanctions, political pressure, a bunch of other things herald the collapse of this regime before Israel has to make these kinds of painful decisions. But I do think that diplomacy is not the way to go at this point. that if we learned anything from the JCPOA, and the Obama folks admit it, the Biden folks admit it, it kicked the can down the road. It did not permanently cut off all the pathways to a nuclear weapon, which was the promise that we heard from the Biden administration ad nauseum. That was never the case. 2030, give or take, is the time that Iran would have a nuclear weapon had we stayed in the deal. So if we go back into it, we have the same problem, and there is no such thing as longer or stronger. It is a flawed deal from start to finish, and it is something that Israel can't live with. So I would fully expect there to be some kinetic activity that would ultimately prevent Iran from getting that weapon.
Yeah. Oh.
I just want to add that I think we are really in sort of the end game of this as well, whether or not there will be a new deal or a reentry into the deal. I think we're talking weeks that we'll have an answer. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it seems also that the Iranian side isn't exactly like you said, isn't willing to go to the deal. And let us not forget, if we do negotiate, Iran isn't always the most honest, upfront, or a partner. They've been hiding, and Israel's been saying it for a while, and we saw the archive and Iran's intentions, but. Now the IAEA and the Board of Governors, everybody's basically coming out right and saying Iran is lying, Iran is not showing us everything, Iran is not, is not playing on the same field or the fair game that the partners have wished. And yeah, you're right, Israel cannot, and we're saying not only not have a nuclear weapon, but not have nuclear capabilities, and join that with their missile programs, right? You talked about the missiles that are close to us, but the missiles that Iran is developing for these purposes, it's a reality that Israel will not, will have to deal with before.
I don't think the JCPOA ever goes away. I think it's like the peace process, the two-state solution, and by which I mean interminable process that never reaches a fruition, and that's because Obama misrepresented the JCPOA when he sold it to the American people. He said this is a narrow arms control agreement, has no influence on anything else we're doing with Iran. That's not what it was. It was the leading element and the most visible element of an attempt to completely restructure U.S.-Iranian relations and to find a strategic accommodation with Iran. Like I said before, just like turning the Taliban, as they did overnight, into a partner for the United States. The Democrats have turned Iran into a partner, if not into a partner, into the object of diplomacy. And the people who are opposed to the process of turning Iran into a partner, the process of trying to turn Iran into a partner, are the party of war. That's the Bibi Netanyahus, the evangelicals, anyone else. Most of you, I'm sure, you're all part of the party of war. That's not going away, regardless of what the Iranians do. They tried to kidnap somebody, this Iranian dissident in New York. How long did the outrage over that last? They elected a mass murderer. How long did the outrage over that last? They continue all manner of aggressive actions around the region. How outraged is anyone by that? It's not going to, the failure, I don't believe that the Iranians are going to conclude the negotiations over the JCPOA anytime soon at all. They're continuing to get concessions while the negotiations are going on. Just yesterday, the administration, while the negotiations are supposedly frozen and not going on, the administration delisted a number of Iranian entities from the sanctions. So they lifted sanctions on these. Why did they do that? Under what? How are they negotiating? Clearly, there are European intermediaries going back and forth between the Iranians and us. So I think what's going to replace the JCPOA, the formal JCPOA, is an informal JCPOA. by which the Iranians tell the Americans through the Europeans, or maybe directly here and there, that they will keep stockpiles at a certain level, that they won't introduce this or that new centrifuge, and so forth. And in return, they want sanctions relief. And sanctions relief will take place, will take two forms, like we saw on Friday, where entities are actually formally delisted. And then we'll have informal sanctions relief, like we've been getting with Iranian sales of oil to China. Those sales are going through the roof right now. That's in violation of U.S. sanctions, but the United States is not enforcing those sanctions. And so a sanction that's not enforced is the same as a sanction that doesn't exist from the Iranian point of view. What do they care about the technicalities of American law? That's kind of even preferable for an administration that is already very adept at misrepresenting what it's actually doing with regard to Iran and its proxies, because it can stand with a straight face and say, we have not ended the sanctions. The sanctions regime remains in place. It's just not being enforced.
A quick, just on a personal note, I have, obviously being a leader of an organization, get asked a lot of questions, a lot of times to make statements about, how do you feel about Biden? How do you feel about Trump? How do you feel about the Israel administration changing over, Bibi, etc.? My answer, and if you know me personally, of course, you may know my views and my politics, but if you don't, my answer always is, I stand with Israel. And that's the true answer. I stand with Israel. That's how I wake up in the morning, and I live and I breathe and I advocate, and I really do try to do as much as I can, as does the rest of the staff at BZD, live, breathe, advocate, and for Israel. And that is what we do on a daily basis. And just a quick look around the room for the people that are here. I know that the people that aren't here, but just a quick look around the room, just myself, Nathan, who's here from Stand With Us, who I work with very closely every day. Just look at the age range of the people that are here right now, apart from maybe Nathan and myself and a few others who bring down the age group by a bit. We need to get the younger generation to appreciate Israel as the older generation that is here right now appreciated Israel back when Israel was first established, because we are missing that right now with our younger generation. And that's really the point that I want to get across, is that we're missing that piece right now, is where the young people are right now. And that's heartfelt to me. That's what we do every day. And that's the educational piece that we're working on and that we're really trying to bring forth, that we're missing the young people right now. I'm sure that you guys have seen that in your work. And thank you, all of you. Have an amazing week. Shavua Tov. Thank you so much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.